the heavy signet ring pressed into the hot, molten wax, leaving an imprint that could not be undone. It was a single, clinical motion, yet it carried the weight of a death sentence for an entire people. The king withdrew his hand, the metal clicking against the stone table. Outside the chamber, the palace of Susa hummed with its usual rhythm, unaware that the air had just turned stagnant with the scent of impending ruin. A royal scribe rolled the parchment, tied it with thick cord, and handed it to the waiting rider. The decree was absolute. It was to be carried to every province, every city, and every village under the king's domain. The rider vaulted into the saddle. His heels dug deep, and the horse bolted through the palace gates. He was only the first of many. Soon, the roads would be filled with messengers, each carrying the same mandate. On the 13th day of Adar, not a single Jewish life was to be spared. The sun began to dip behind the horizon, casting long, jagged shadows over the capital. The order was out. There was no way to recall the riders. There was no way to stop the clock. Far from the capital, the morning marketplace in a remote province was bustling. Merchants called out prices, and the smell of fresh grain filled the air. Then, the sound of rhythmic hoofbeats cut through the noise. A rider in royal colors slowed, tossing a scroll into the hands of the local governor. The governor broke the seal, read the lines, and his face drained of color. He stood frozen, the parchment trembling in his grip. A merchant nearby stopped mid-sentence, his basket of fruit hitting the dirt as he stared at the governor. The silence spread like a contagion. People gathered, murmuring, until the governor read the decree aloud. The reaction was instant. Mothers grabbed their children, pulling them away from the open streets. Men stood paralyzed, their hands gripped tight on the tools of their trade. The marketplace emptied in seconds, leaving only overturned crates and scattered produce. Doors slammed shut across the city. Barricades were dragged against frames. Every window shuttered tight. In every home, the people sat in the dark, staring at the walls, waiting for the day that had just been marked on their calendar. The threat had arrived, and the distance from the palace offered no protection at all. In the capital of Susa, the news reached Mordecai not as a rumor, but as a suffocating weight. He stood in the marketplace when the heralds finished their reading, his hands clenching until his knuckles turned white. Without a word, he gripped the edges of his tunic and pulled. The fabric groaned, then gave way with a sharp, jagged tear that echoed against the stone walls of the gate. He did not stop until the material hung in useless strips around his frame. He gathered coarse, abrasive sackcloth and wrapped it tightly over his skin, the rough fibers scratching against his chest. He threw a handful of gray ash into the air, letting the dust settle into his hair and across his face. He walked to the main entrance of the palace, ignoring the stares of the guards and the whispers of the passing crowds. He sat down, hard on the cold threshold. He did not move. He did not speak. He became a living monument to the impending slaughter, blocking the path of those who walked in and out of the king's house. Every official who passed had to look down at the man in the dirt. He was a jagged stone in the smooth machinery of the court, forcing the palace to witness the agony they had authored. Inside the palace, the air felt thick with incense and the scent of lilies. Servants moved silently across polished marble floors, their footsteps muffled by heavy tapestries that blocked out the city's noise. Esther sat in a room where the sunlight filtered through gold lattice screens, casting long, geometric shadows across the floor. She watched the dust motes dance in the light, a stark contrast to the reports of chaos that had reached her ears. Her attendants spoke in low, measured tones, avoiding any mention of the decree or the man sitting in the dust at the outer gates. They poured wine and offered delicacies, maintaining the illusion of a world untouched by the king's command. Esther pushed the silver platter away. The silence of the palace felt heavy, like a held breath. She stood and walked to the high window, peering down toward the distant entrance. She could not see the gate, but she felt the shift in the atmosphere. The guards were pacing more frequently, their metal gear clinking with an irregular, nervous rhythm. News of the man in sackcloth had finally penetrated the inner chambers. Her attendants whispered about the disruption at the gate, their eyes darting toward her, then down at the floor. Esther turned back to the room, the gilded walls suddenly feeling like the bars of a cage. A messenger entered the chamber, his boots clicking sharply against the stone. He did not bow with the usual practiced grace. He stopped 5 paces from Esther, his chest heaving, and produced a scroll tied with a simple, frayed cord. He held it out with trembling hands. Esther took the parchment, the edges rough against her fingertips. She unfurled the scroll, her eyes scanning the ink. The words were blunt, stripped of all courtly pleasantries. "Do not think that because you are in the palace you will escape," the message read. "Who knows if you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" Esther read the lines twice. The air in the room seemed to thin. She looked up, but the messenger had already retreated, leaving her alone with the ink-stained warning. The walls of the room, once symbols of her status, now felt like thin, brittle paper. She realized the king's reach was absolute, and her sanctuary was merely a temporary illusion. The decree was not a distant threat to a nameless population. It was a deadline fixed to her own life. She looked down at the scroll again, her knuckles tightening until her skin turned pale. The responsibility was no longer a burden she could delegate to the city guards or the palace ministers. It belonged to her. Esther paced the length of her chamber, counting the steps. 10, 20, 50. She stopped, staring at the heavy cedar doors that led toward the inner court. She knew the law better than anyone. To approach the king without an invitation was a death sentence. The rule was absolute, written in stone and enforced by blades. She pictured the inner court, the vast, polished expanse of marble, the rows of guards with spears held at the ready, and the king seated on his raised dais. She would have to walk that distance alone, every eye in the room fixed on her. If she entered, she lived or died by a single motion of his hand. If he did not raise the gold scepter, the guards would move before she could utter a single word. Her breath hitched. She pressed her palms against the cool stone of the wall, trying to steady her hands. It was not just the danger. It was the sheer finality of the law. One step past the threshold was a commitment that could not be retracted. She looked at her reflection in the polished bronze mirror, her face pale, her jaw set against the rising tide of panic. The silence of the palace felt like a closing trap. The warning echoed in the silence of her quarters, stripped of all doubt. Mordecai had not sent a plea. He had sent a reality check. Esther walked to the balcony, looking down at the sprawling city of Susa. She saw the markets, the gates, and the crowded streets where her people lived, unaware that their end was already scheduled. She touched the cold stone of the railing. Her life in the palace had been a buffer, a distance she had maintained to ensure her own survival. But that distance had just collapsed. Every luxury, every servant, every gilded wall now seemed like a fragile barrier against a closing storm. She realized then that there was no neutral ground. She could not hide behind the title of queen while the decree hunted her own blood. The realization did not bring comfort. It brought a singular, sharp clarity. She turned away from the city, her gaze hardening. The palace guards stood at their posts, immobile and indifferent, but their presence no longer intimidated her. She had been waiting for a path to appear, but the path was gone. There was only the decision to act or to watch the fire consume everything she had ever known. Esther returned to the small table where the message lay. She did not need to read it again, yet her eyes returned to the ink-stained parchment. She traced the jagged edges of the script with her thumb, feeling the pressure of the quill that had carved those words. Do not think that because you are in the palace you will escape. The sentence hit her with the weight of a physical blow. She moved to the window, the paper trembling slightly in her grip. Outside, the sun was beginning to dip behind the high walls of Susa, casting long, sharp shadows across the courtyard. She read the final line again. Who knows if you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? The words hung in the air, stripped of their urgency, leaving only a cold, hard truth. Her life had been a series of choices, of moments leading to this specific, narrow intersection of time and fate. She stood still as the light failed, the parchment held tightly in her hand. The question was not about her survival anymore. It was about whether she would let her life be defined by the walls of the palace or by the people who stood beyond them. She folded the message, her movements slow and deliberate, and turned toward the center of the room. Esther set the parchment down on the table. The hesitation that had clouded her movements only moments ago vanished, leaving behind a steady, rhythmic focus. She walked to the heavy oak door and pulled it open, calling her lead attendant into the room. She did not speak in whispers. Her voice was thin but carried a sharp, piercing clarity. She grabbed a fresh scroll and a dipping pen, her hand moving with a sudden, violent speed as she wrote the instructions. Every stroke of the pen was a commitment. She looked at the attendant, her eyes locking onto his, and handed him the scroll. "Go to the gates of Susa," she said. "Find Mordecai. Tell him to gather every Jewish man, woman, and child within the city walls." She paused, the weight of the next words settling into the room. "Tell them to fast. For 3 days and 3 nights, no one is to eat or drink. I and my attendants will do the same." She watched the attendant bow and retreat, his footsteps echoing down the stone corridor. The air in the room felt different now, stripped of its previous stillness. She had crossed the threshold, and there was no turning back. She walked back to the window, watching the messenger disappear into the darkening streets of Susa. The decree spread through the narrow streets of Susa like a cold wind. Shopkeepers pulled their shutters closed, the wooden slats clattering into place with a final, hollow sound. In the workshops, the rhythm of hammers stopped. The fires beneath the ovens were extinguished, one by one, until the scent of baking bread vanished from the air. Families retreated behind their doors, not to hide, but to comply. By sunset, the markets were empty. The noise of the city, usually a constant hum, died away into a heavy, unnatural quiet. Men sat on the floor, their hands resting idle in their laps, refusing the evening meal. Mothers gathered their children, moving with slow, measured steps, and set aside the water jars. No one spoke, no one ate, no one drank. A collective stillness took hold of the Jewish quarters. Every house held the same silence, a shared refusal of sustenance that bound the people together in an unseen, rigid line. The city continued its chaotic life outside those walls, but within the homes of the faithful, time seemed to halt. The fast was not a prayer of words, but a physical endurance of hunger, a stark, visible wall erected against the encroaching threat. Inside the palace, the rhythm of life abruptly fractured. Esther retreated into her private chambers and latched the heavy bronze bolt. Her attendants moved in silence, their footsteps muffled by thick rugs. They cleared the tables of fruit, bread, and silver wine flagons, carrying the trays away until the rooms stood bare. No servants approached with midday refreshments. The usual clatter of dishes and the distant laughter of courtiers stopped. Esther sat on the floor, her back against the cool, plastered wall. She watched the shadows creep across the ceiling as the sun traced its path outside. Her attendants mirrored her, sitting in a circle, hands folded, eyes fixed on the floor. Every window was shut to block out the sounds of the palace gardens. The air inside the room grew stagnant, lacking the scent of cooking or the sound of flowing water. She did not move for hours. Her focus remained on the door, measuring the passage of time by the changing light on the floorboards. Outside, the world continued its frantic pace, but here, the silence was absolute. It was a vacuum, a space carved out of the palace luxury, filled only by the weight of the coming confrontation. By the second day, the hunger became a physical weight. Esther sat motionless, yet the air in the room seemed to vibrate. When she shifted her position, the floor beneath her felt tilted, and the light from the narrow window blurred into white streaks. She reached for the edge of a low table to pull herself up, but her fingers lacked the strength to grip. Her hand slid across the polished wood. She paused, pressed her palms flat against the cool surface, and waited for the room to stop spinning. Beside her, an attendant reached out to steady her, but Esther shook her head and pushed herself upright. She walked to the window. Her steps were measured, slow, and intentional. Outside, the palace fountains continued to flow, the sound of water taunting her. She focused on the rhythm of her own breathing, counting each inhale until the tremors in her limbs subsided. Her eyes remained fixed on the horizon, toward the inner court gates. She stood straight, shoulders back, refusing to let the weakness of her body dictate the outcome. Every passing hour stripped away more of her energy, but her focus sharpened. She was readying herself for the threshold. The third day arrived with a pale, thin light. Esther stood, her body lighter, yet steady. She signaled to her attendants. They moved to the heavy chests, lifting the lids with a metallic scrape that echoed in the quiet room. She washed her face, the water cold and sharp against her skin, washing away the remnants of the fast. One by one, she layered the heavy fabrics. The sensation of the material was grounding. She pulled the tight bands firm, ensuring every fold was set. There was no mirror, yet she knew the alignment of her frame. She stepped into her sandals, the leather straps biting into her heels, and stood straight. Her attendants adjusted the final layers, their movements precise and devoid of sound. She checked the weight of her movements, feeling the shift of the fabric against her shoulders and legs. Her breathing remained slow, controlled, and deep. She took a final look at her hands, now steady and firm. She turned toward the doorway that led to the inner courtyard. The transition was complete. She moved with deliberate purpose, her stride even, leaving behind the silence of the chambers for the unknown path ahead. She reached the threshold and stopped, her gaze fixed on the distance. Esther stood at the edge of the inner court. The transition from the corridor to the open space felt like stepping into a vacuum. The ceiling vaulted high above, swallowing the sound of her own breath. She looked forward. The throne sat at the far end, a distant island of gold and shadow. Between her and that destination lay an expanse of polished stone that felt impossibly long. She did not move. She planted her feet firmly, feeling the cold transfer through the soles of her feet. Guards stood at intervals along the perimeter, their spears held upright, heads turned toward her. They did not speak. They did not signal. They simply observed. She counted the heartbeats in her throat, one by one. The air here was stagnant, smelling of incense and old dust. A bead of sweat traced a slow line down her temple, but she did not wipe it away. To blink felt like a lapse. To shift her weight felt like a surrender. The silence stretched, thin and brittle, ready to snap under the slightest pressure. She watched the light shift across the floorboards as the sun moved behind the palace walls. She was a single point of presence in a vast, indifferent chamber. She looked directly at the throne, braced her core, and held the line. The silence in the inner court deepened. Every muscle in Esther's body remained locked, a statue of absolute stillness. Then, the sound of a heavy footfall broke the tension. The king shifted on his throne. The movement was slow, deliberate, and carried the weight of absolute power. He leaned forward, the gold of his seat glinting under the harsh light of the morning sun. The guards flanking the dais pulled their spears back, the metal heads clinking softly as they braced for a command. Their eyes flicked from the king to the lone figure standing on the stone floor. Esther did not move. She kept her chin level and her gaze fixed. The king's head turned. His eyes swept across the vast, empty space, passing over the marble pillars and the vacant air before landing directly on her. He stared. The air in the room grew heavy, almost thick enough to choke. No one breathed. The guards went rigid, their knuckles whitening against their weapons. Esther held her position, feeling the weight of his scrutiny pressing down on her shoulders. The atmosphere vibrated with the sudden, sharp focus of the monarch. He did not look away, and in that protracted second, the fate of every person in the kingdom seemed to hover in the space between their gazes. The king did not blink. His right hand rose, the movement fluid and rhythmic. He reached toward the side of his throne, fingers closing around the ornate handle of the gold scepter. With a slow, deliberate motion, he extended it outward. The metal caught the light, casting a sharp, brilliant reflection across the stone floor between them. The guards lowered their spears, the metallic scraping sound echoing through the high-vaulted chamber. The threat of immediate execution vanished. Esther drew a steadying breath, the tension in her chest loosening as she took the first step forward. Her boots clicked against the marble, a rhythmic sound in the sudden quiet of the court. She reached the base of the dais and extended her arm. Her fingers brushed the cold, solid tip of the gold. The contact was brief, firm, and final. She felt the weight of the moment pass. She stood upright, waiting for the command that would break the silence. The king remained motionless, his eyes still locked on her, but the hostility had evaporated. He leaned back, his posture shifting from defensive to attentive. The court had held its breath, and now, the air rushed back into the room. The king broke the silence. His voice carried across the marble floor, resonant and expectant. "What is your request, Esther? Even half the kingdom shall be given to you." The offer hung in the air, a vast and dangerous promise. Esther bowed her head, her movements precise and measured. She did not rush. She knew that a single misstep would undo the survival of her people. She stood straight again, keeping her eyes fixed on the king. "If it pleases the king," she began, her tone steady. "Let the king and Haman come today to a banquet I have prepared." The king nodded, a sharp, quick motion of his head. He signaled to his attendants, his interest piqued by the unexpected mention of his advisor. Haman, standing near the edge of the dais, shifted his weight and straightened his stance, catching the king's eye. The king turned his head toward the advisor and gave a brief, curt command. The room began to stir. Servants moved along the walls, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the heavy carpets. Esther turned and walked toward the archway, her exit deliberate. She had laid the first stone of her foundation. The target was set. The banquet would begin before the sun reached its zenith. The banquet hall glowed with the light of 100 lamps. Wine flowed into silver goblets, the liquid dark and shimmering. The king sat at the head of the table, his posture relaxed, though his attention remained fixed on Esther. Haman occupied the seat to his right, his face flushed with the prestige of the invitation. Esther watched the servants move in silence, pouring wine and carving meat. The air grew heavy with the smell of roasted spice and cedar. The king wiped his mouth with a linen cloth and leaned forward. "The wine is excellent, Esther. Now, tell me your request. What is it that you truly seek?" He rested his chin on his palm, waiting. Esther felt the weight of Haman's eyes on her. She did not speak immediately. She reached for her own goblet, her fingers tracing the rim, and looked at the king. "If I have found favor in your sight, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition, let the king and Haman come to a second banquet I will prepare tomorrow." The king laughed, a short, sharp sound that echoed against the stone walls. He gestured for more wine. "It shall be done." Haman shifted in his chair, his expression unreadable, while Esther lowered her gaze. The trap was not yet sprung. Haman left the palace with his head high, chest swelled with the arrogance of a man who believed he held the king's favor. He walked through the main plaza, his stride long and purposeful. He felt untouchable. Then, he passed the gate. Mordecai sat there, unmoving, eyes fixed on the horizon. He did not rise. He did not bow. He did not acknowledge Haman's presence at all. Haman stopped mid-step. The heat of his rage flared, sharp and sudden. He walked back to his house, teeth gritted, his mind twisting with a single, dark obsession. He called for his wife and his closest friends. He recounted the banquet, the prestige of being the only one invited alongside the king. Yet his voice shook with the singular venom of Mordecai's defiance. He could not rest while that man remained in his sight. He commanded his servants to gather timber and iron. In the courtyard, the sound of sawing wood and the heavy impact of iron nails began to echo into the night. They built it high, 75 feet of jagged wood reaching toward the stars. Haman watched the structure rise, satisfied by the height, planning the end of his enemy. He did not know that the wood was being shaped for his own neck. The king lay on his bed, but his eyes remained open, tracing the patterns of the ceiling in the dim lamplight. He shifted, flipped the heavy coverlet, and sat up. The air in the royal chamber felt stagnant. He stood and walked to the window, looking out over the silent city of Susa. Sleep refused to come. He paced the length of the room, his bare feet striking the cold stone floor with a rhythmic, hollow sound. He stopped at the table, drained a cup of water, and turned back to the dark interior. The silence of the palace was absolute, amplifying the ticking of the clock and the rustle of his own movements. He needed a distraction. He strode to the door and shouted for his servant. The man appeared instantly, bowing low. The king gestured toward the archives. "Bring the records," he commanded. "Bring the book of the Chronicles of the Kings." The servant bowed again and retreated. Moments later, he returned with a heavy, dust-covered scroll. The king settled back into his bed, propped the scroll against his knees, and signaled for the servant to begin reading. The sound of the parchment unrolling crackled through the quiet room as the history of the realm began to unfold. The servant cleared his throat and began to read. The voice was low, monotone, and steady. It recited administrative lists, tax records, and minor court appointments. The king listened, his gaze fixed on the flickering candle flame. The servant reached a passage regarding the palace guards. He paused, turned the page, and continued. He read of 2 chamberlains who had guarded the doorway to the inner court. The king sat up straighter. The servant read how those 2 men had conspired to lay hands on the king to strike him down. The king leaned forward, his hands gripping the edges of the bedframe. The servant read on, detailing how the plot was uncovered and thwarted. The king held up a hand. "Stop," he commanded. The room fell silent. The king took the scroll. He traced the lines of ink with his finger. The name was there, Mordecai, the man who sat at the gate, the man who had saved the life of the monarch. The king looked at the servant. "What honor or dignity was bestowed upon this man for this?" he asked. The servant looked down, shifting his weight. "Nothing has been done for him," the man replied. The king stared at the parchment, his jaw tightening as the truth of the oversight settled into the room. The king did not wait for dawn. He summoned Haman to the inner court while the stars still hung in the sky. Haman entered, his face set in a mask of practiced loyalty, already formulating a new request to dispose of his enemy. The king looked down from his throne, his voice cold. What should be done for the man whom the king delights to honor? Haman, assuming the honor was for himself, stepped forward. "Let him be led through the city square," Haman declared. "Place him on the royal horse. Let a nobleman proclaim before him, 'This is the man the king delights to honor.'" The king nodded. "Go," he commanded. "Do exactly as you have said for Mordecai the Jew who sits at the gate." Haman froze. The color drained from his face as the order hit him. He turned and walked into the streets, finding Mordecai still in his place. Haman brought the royal horse, forced the man he hated into the saddle, and grasped the bridle. He walked ahead, his head bowed, shouting the proclamation through the crowded market. Every step was a fresh blow to his pride. He led his enemy through the streets of Susa, watched by the entire city, while Mordecai rode in silence. Haman walked into the banquet hall with his gaze fixed firmly on the floor. He kept his distance from the table, his movements stiff and hesitant. The air in the room was heavy, smelling of roasted meats and expensive wine, but the usual laughter was absent. The king sat at the center, a golden goblet resting untouched in his hand. He watched Haman enter, his eyes narrowing. Esther sat across from them, her posture rigid, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She did not glance at Haman, nor did she acknowledge his presence. The servants moved silently, placing platters on the table, but the clatter of silver against porcelain sounded like weapons striking. The king set his goblet down. The sharp click echoed against the stone walls. He leaned forward, his shadow stretching across the table toward the guests. "This is the second day, Esther," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet. "You have asked for a banquet, and you have received it." He paused, his gaze shifting from the queen to the man sitting beside her. "Now, state your petition. What is your request?" "Now, even to half the kingdom, it shall be granted." The silence that followed was absolute. Haman stood frozen, his breath hitching in his throat, waiting for the words that would decide his fate. Esther rose. The heavy fabric of her chair scraped against the stone floor, a sound that seemed to ring through the entire hall. She did not look at the wine or the spread of food. She kept her eyes locked on the king. She drew a breath, her chest rising and falling in a controlled rhythm. "If I have found favor in your eyes, O king," she began, her voice steady and echoing against the vaulted ceiling, "let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request." She paused, letting the weight of the words settle. "For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated." The king's hand, which had been resting on the table, tightened into a fist. He leaned back, his eyes searching her face for a trace of hesitation. Finding none, he shifted his gaze to the room, the air suddenly turning frigid. Esther stepped further into the center of the light, her posture rigid, her hands held open and empty. "If we had been sold as slaves, I would have held my peace," she said, her tone sharpening. "But this enemy brings ruin that the king cannot ignore." The king stood up, his chair clattering backward. He waited for the name. The king took a step toward the table, his face a mask of sudden, cold fury. He did not shout. He leaned down, his eyes fixed on Esther, and his voice dropped to a low, dangerous rumble. "Who is he?" he demanded. "Where is the man who dares to presume in his heart to do such a thing?" Esther did not flinch. She turned slowly, her movement deliberate and sharp. She swung her arm out, the motion fluid, slicing through the heavy air of the banquet hall. Her finger did not tremble. She pointed directly at the man sitting mere inches from her. Haman pulled back, his chair scraping violently against the floor, but he was trapped by the sheer weight of the accusation. Esther held her position, her hands steady, her gaze locked onto his face. "The adversary and enemy," she said, her voice ringing clear and cold across the silent room, "is this wicked Haman." The name hung in the air, echoing against the stone walls. The servants near the tapestries froze, dropping their gaze. The king turned his head, his eyes shifting from the queen to the man cowering beside her. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He stood perfectly still, his hand hovering near his side, waiting for the reality of the betrayal to take full hold. The king did not speak. His face darkened, veins pulsing at his temples, and he turned sharply on his heel. He strode toward the heavy oak doors, his boots striking the floor with a rhythmic, thunderous sound, and vanished into the palace garden to compose his rage. Haman remained, his skin drained of color. He scrambled from his seat, his hands shaking as he reached out toward Esther. He lunged across the small distance between them, falling to his knees and grasping at the edge of the table to pull himself closer, his eyes wide with a desperate, frantic need to beg for his life. He reached out to grab her, his movements erratic and frantic. At that precise moment, the king stepped back through the doorway. He stopped dead. He saw Haman lunging toward the queen, his hands outstretched in a way that looked like a final, desperate attack. The king's eyes widened. He drew a sharp, audible breath. He pointed a trembling finger at the man on the floor. "Will he even assault the queen while I am in the house?" he roared. The air in the hall shattered. The guards, who had been standing like statues, moved forward, their hands dropping to the hilts of their swords, surrounding the man on the floor. The guards moved with mechanical precision. They pinned Haman to the floor, his face pressed against the cold stone, his frantic pleas muffled by the rough grip of ironclad hands. The king did not look down. He signaled toward the chamberlain. "Take him." the king commanded. "Remove the man who thought to silence my house." The guards hauled Haman to his feet, his limbs dragging, his body limp with the sudden collapse of his influence. They shoved a heavy cloth over his head, effectively blindfolding him, and forced him toward the exit. The hall, once filled with the clatter of silver and wine, fell into a hollow, echoing silence. Only the sound of boots on stone remained. They marched him through the courtyard, past the rows of stunned attendants, and out into the crisp, biting air of the palace grounds. The wooden structure loomed ahead, a jagged silhouette against the darkening sky. It was the very frame he had commissioned for another, now standing empty, waiting for its architect. The guards increased their pace, the wood creaking under the weight of the coming end. Haman stumbled, but they did not wait for him to find his footing. They shoved him forward, closing the distance to the shadow of the gallows he had built with his own hands. The king returned to the feast hall, his breathing steady, the fury drained from his posture. He gestured to his royal scribes. They entered with rolls of parchment and ink-stained fingers, kneeling before the throne. The king dictated, his voice echoing against the vaulted ceiling. He spoke of a new decree, one to override the previous, lethal command. The scribes moved their quills across the surface with frantic speed, the scratching sound filling the void where the tension had been. The king reached into his robes, pulled out the heavy gold ring, and pressed it into the hot wax on each scroll. The seal hardened. He handed the documents to the messengers waiting by the door. These scrolls granted the Jewish people across every province the legal right to assemble, to arm themselves, and to resist any who sought their destruction. The messengers turned and sprinted toward the gates, their horses waiting in the courtyard. The shadow of the previous decree disintegrated with every mile they covered. Men and women who had been hiding in the dark now stepped into the light, clutching the new royal mandates. The threat did not merely fade. It was countered by the weight of the law, turning the tide of the entire empire in a single, decisive hour. The news moved faster than the wind. In every corner of Susa, the messengers arrived, their lungs burning, their horses lathered in sweat. They unrolled the scrolls in the public squares, the royal seal catching the afternoon sun. People gathered in tight, trembling groups, but as the words were read aloud, the tension snapped. The silence that had gripped the city for weeks broke into a roar. Men and women tore the sackcloth from their shoulders, casting the rough, gray fabric into the dirt. They pulled out lamps and candles, lighting the streets until the darkness of the alleys was pushed back by a sea of flickering gold. The fear that had kept them hiding in the shadows evaporated. Neighbors who had turned away now embraced, their voices rising in songs that had been forbidden for months. In the market stalls, merchants reopened their shutters, and the smell of fresh bread and roasted meat returned to the air. No one looked down when they walked. They moved with their heads held high, their presence a defiant statement of life. The terror was gone, replaced by the sound of bells and the rhythmic thrum of drums, as a city long held under the weight of extinction found its voice again. The palace returned to its rhythms, but the foundations had shifted forever. Esther walked through the long, marble corridors where she had once paced in silent terror. The air no longer tasted of impending doom. It carried the scent of incense and the distant, rhythmic hum of a city finally at peace. She remained within these walls, no longer a hidden participant in her own fate, but a central figure in the court. Her influence reached into the furthest provinces, weaving through the administrative heart of the empire. She stood by the high windows, watching the horizon where the sun set over a nation she had saved. Her single act of stepping into the inner court had shattered the momentum of a massacre and redefined the course of history. The records would show the date, the decree, and the reversal, but they would also carry the story of a decision made in the face of absolute certainty of death. She turned away from the light, her movements steady and deliberate. The fear had served its purpose and vanished. What remained was the quiet, enduring weight of a legacy that had rewritten the destiny of an entire people, ensuring their survival long after the banners of the feast were lowered and the final echoes of the celebration faded into the night.